The first section of ecology notes will be an introduction to ecology in general that we will expand upon in the future sections of notes. Ecology is the scientific study of how organisms and their environment interact with one another. The environment is going to include anything that's alive, but also anything that's not alive. The biotic components are known as the living things. So bio means life. Anything alive within that particular environment is a biotic component. So all the animals, all the plants, all the fungi, all the protists, all the bacteria. If it's alive, it's biotic. Anything not alive is considered to be abiotic. A means not or without, so without life or not alive. So this is going to be anything that's non-living. For example, temperature fluctuations or amount of light that's available, amount of water or precipitation that's occurring within that area, nutrients within the soil, such as nitrogen, phosphorus, things that plants will need to be able to uptake, wind, pH, the rocks, anything non-living is abiotic. Different parts of the world will be affected differently in regards to their abiotic factors, and this will cause differences in biotic factors as well. So one thing that is known to affect the environment are the seasons. What causes the seasons to occur, and how do these seasons affect the environment? Seasons are caused by the tilt of the Earth's axis. The Earth actually sits on a tilt on its axis, and this is going to cause the sun to hit different parts of the Earth at more direct angles and much more wide angles at different parts of the year. This is going to cause certain parts of the Earth to experience more seasonal variation and other parts of the Earth to experience less seasonal variation. So at the equator, the sun actually hits the equator most directly, and it hits it pretty directly almost all year long. This is why there's no seasons typically at the equator. These are going to be ecosystems that are incredibly stable. They don't have any seasonal variation, and they tend to get about 12 hours of day and 12 hours of night all year long. Very, very stable in that regards. Lots of water as well. The farther you go from the equator, the more extreme the seasons will get. So if you look at like midway between the equator and the pole in either direction, those parts of the Earth do experience seasons, and typically all 4 seasons. So if we think about like the Midwest, for example, that's a great example of a place in the United States that does experience seasons. And so that means that they're going to have longer summers and shorter winters, or longer days, daylight in the summer, more access to the sun. The days are much longer in the summer, and then the days get shorter, the nights get longer in the winter, again because of the tilt of the Earth's axis. And then as you get to the poles, they are much more extreme, where the poles are hit at an extreme angle all year long. And so because of this, they typically experience 2 seasons only, a very cold season, a winter, and then a summer. And during their summers, which are still, they're not as warm as other parts of the world when we think of summer, but during the poles summers, they will have very, very long days. Like there are times where it's almost 24 hours of daylight at this time of year at the poles. And then the winters are the extreme opposite, almost 24 hours of darkness at the poles during their winters. Latitude is another thing that also affects environment because again, things are going to drastically change as you go from the equator towards the pole. This image starts at kind of mid-latitude, so the equator would be much farther down in this direction. This is like the halfway point between the equator and towards the pole. And you can see a lot of variation as you go up. You get, for example, less or more of the sort of seasonal trees here, the deciduous trees, the ones that would lose their leaves. But as you get higher in elevation, you can see that we have like the conifers. These are going to be like cone-bearing trees, just very different types of organisms. And then less and less trees as you go up, getting closer to the poles, which are very, very icy. And so again, because of these fluctuations in these abiotic factors, that of course is going to affect the biotic components within those areas as well. And as you get closer and closer to the pole, or to the equator, things become much more diverse. So lots of stable ecosystems the closer you are to the equator due to the stability of the sunlight all year long, as well as precipitation. Ocean depth is another thing that can affect the environment. There's going to be little ecosystems all throughout the ocean. The deeper you go, the more different it becomes. And that is, of course, because of differences in ocean depth. So what are some things that are different the deeper you go in the ocean? Well, temperature, for one, is going to be very different. It gets much, much colder down here than it is up here. It also gets less access to light. There's a lot of light rays that don't make it all the way down here, and so different types of organisms will grow down there. In fact, as you get closer to the top up here, that's where you see a lot of like seaweed and green algae, for example, the typical algae that you would think of. But deeper in the ocean, they tend to actually have different kinds of algae, for example, red algae. This is because different wavelengths of light will be able to make it down easier to those lower organisms, and so they will be able to actually use different types of light. So they actually are going to not use red light and reflect it back, which is going to allow for plants and other photosynthetic algae up here that can use red light well, not have to compete with the ones down here. Other things that change are pressure, just in general darkness. So you would have, animals, for example, that have heightened senses that live down here that don't include sight, like fish that lives in caves that maybe are blind, things like that. You're also going to get changes in salinity as you go deeper into the ocean. So all of these abiotic components vary at the different ocean depths, and that of course affects the biotic components that live there as well. Ecology can be divided into 4 increasingly comprehensive levels of study. So starting with the smallest level is organismal ecology. At the organismal level, we'll really just study sort of the ways that individual organisms interact with their environment. Each environment is going to pose challenges to these organisms, and organisms will have specific adaptations that help them cope with those specific challenges. One of the things that organisms have to be able to do is get access to food. Some organisms can make their own food and other organisms cannot. Organisms that can make their own food are called autotrophs. Troph means food and auto means self. So autotrophs are organisms that make their own food, typically through photosynthesis. Those are the types of autotrophs that we'll typically focus on for a while, and then we'll get into some other examples as well. Heterotrophs are organisms that depend on other organisms as their food source. So again, troph means food and hetero means other. There's different types of heterotrophs. Consumers are the types of heterotrophs that feed on organisms by taking them in or ingesting them. Detritivores and saprotrophs are both examples of different types of decomposers, but they do the overall process quite a bit differently. Detritivores are going to be organisms that break down dead or detritus or decaying material by taking that material in and digesting it internally. And then they will use any of those nutrients that they can and then eliminate any nutrients that they cannot use or don't need back to the soil, and therefore those nutrients are now able to be accessed by the plants. So decomposers, they help to recycle organic nutrients. And then saprotrophs are different because they can't actually take in organisms. There's no actual internal digestion. Instead, they secrete enzymes into the decaying organic matter or dead organic matter and break it down externally. So it gets broken down through those enzymatic reactions outside of the actual organism, and then they take in those nutrients back in to the saprotroph. Any nutrients that they cannot use would remain. So a good example of a detritivore would be something like an earthworm, right? Because earthworms are decomposers. They'll be like leaf matter on the ground as they fall from the trees, and we need these types of organisms to break down that detritus material. But saprotrophs would be more like a fungus because fungi can release those enzymes, break it down, and then absorb the nutrients. So if you've ever seen like mold growing on an orange, for example, and all of a sudden it gets very juicy, that is because of the enzymes that the mold has secreted. Here's some pictures of organisms. Consumer. Sounds pretty straightforward. And then here's some detritivores. So I gave the example of the earthworm. Roly-poly bugs are a good example. Cockroaches. There's lots of examples. Crabs, for example. Shrimp. Those are also good examples of detritivores. Saprotrophs are shown on the bottom, so you can see fungi like mushrooms or molds. And then many types of bacteria also do tend to be saprotrophic. There are exceptions to this rule where organisms are not exclusively autotrophic or not exclusively heterotrophic. Euglena is a protist that is considered to be a facultative mixotroph. A facultative mixotroph will undergo photosynthesis when there is light available, but if there's not enough light, that's when it will instead feed on detritus or smaller organisms through the process of endocytosis. So it's like photosynthesis is the main source, but if they can't have access to light, then they can consume other organisms as a backup method to be able to get food. And remember, we went over endocytosis in BioH, where a substance enters the cell by pushing its way into the cell membrane. A vesicle forms around it, and it brings it in that way. And so here's a little sort of animation on that. Here shows you a picture of Euglena. And this is a specific IB example. I would make sure you know Euglena, just because they tend to bring it up a lot as an example of a mixotroph. A different type of mixotroph is called an obligate mixotroph. Obligate mixotrophs are organisms that cannot grow or survive unless they use both autotrophic and heterotrophic modes of nutrition. So it's not like they do one in the absence of the other. They have to do both. Some species of golden algae are examples of obligate mixotrophs. Another term in regards to nutritional uptake is called holozoic nutrition. This is when organisms that consume other organisms take them in, digest them internally, then they both absorb and assimilate those nutrients, and then they're going to eliminate the waste. So you might think of like a typical animal as an organism that does display holozoic nutrition. For example, humans, right? Humans do digestion this way. We have this type of nutrition, and so do a lot of other animals, like earthworms, birds, etc. But not all animals are actually holozoic. Spiders are a great example of an organism that's not holozoic. This is because they don't just ingest an organism right away. Instead, they inject digestive enzymes into their prey. Then they let the enzymes break it down. That kind of turns it into this liquid, and then they suck out the liquids, in which case, at that point, they can absorb and assimilate those nutrients. The next level of ecology is populations. Populations are going to be organisms that all belong to the same species and live in the same general area. So I would make sure you underline same species, same area. They have to satisfy both in order to be considered a population. A species, remember, is a group of organisms that can reproduce with each other to make viable and fertile offspring. So viability and fertility, viable means able to live, fertility means it can also reproduce, are key to this definition. The next level up is communities. Communities are going to be different populations of organisms that all live together and interact together within the same area. For example, a population of lions that lives in northern Africa is different from the population of lions that lives in southern Africa, even if they belong to the same species. But if we go back to one of those locations, northern Africa, and we study the population of lions there, and the zebras, and the grasses, and the hyenas, and the bacteria, and the trees, now we're studying the community within that particular area. All of these species have developed relationships where they depend on each other for their survival. Relationships like predation or competition between species or within species. And we'll talk about more of these in a future unit. Ecosystems is the next level. Ecosystems include communities as well as their abiotic factors that also affect that particular area. So now it's not just the living organisms within that community, but now we're also studying their non-living components that also matter. So for example, we can look at how energy flows throughout an ecosystem. We can look at nutrient cycling, the carbon cycle, the nitrogen cycle, phosphorus cycle, things like that. We can look at the water cycle and how that affects the ecosystem, temperature changes, and how that affects different organisms and their behaviors. That's all part of an ecosystem. There is actually another level of study. If we study the major types of ecosystems, we're now studying the biomes. Biomes are going to be groups of ecosystems that have similar communities, even though they may be found in different locations within the world. Like they can be in completely different locations. However, they're similar enough due to abiotic conditions that are there. So similar weather patterns, similar types of temperature fluctuations or seasonal variations, things like that. As well as convergent evolution, which we talked about in a previous unit and in BioH. This is going to allow for organisms to develop similar adaptations because their environments are similar, even though the organisms themselves may not be closely related from an evolutionary standpoint. So here we talked about this example previously as well. We have Australia down here, and then we have North America right here. In these two locations in the world, like the Midwest area and certain parts of Australia, very similar environments. So a similar biome in that particular location. So even though the sugar glider and the flying squirrel are very different types of organisms, they did develop that similar webbing between their limbs as a result of convergent evolution due to similar environments. Remember, the sugar glider in Australia is a marsupial, and the flying squirrel in North America is not. So they're actually genetically very diverse. The biomes are affected by abiotic factors, but there are two in particular that do tend to have the greatest influence in determining how the biomes are distributed around the world. And these two abiotic factors would be temperature and precipitation. So you'll often see graphs like this that graph precipitation on one axis and then temperature on the other axis. And then you can see the different types of biomes that could potentially be present there. So here we have like tropical rainforests where the temperatures are really high and the precipitation is also high. And then on this other extreme end, we have the tundra. The tundra has incredibly low temperatures, but also low precipitation. Look down here, desert, right? The desert has very low precipitation, very dry there, but has very high temperatures. So overall, a graph like this should make sense. There's many different types of aquatic or terrestrial biomes. Aquatic biomes are going to be the biomes that involve water mostly. And there are both freshwater aquatic biomes as well as saltwater aquatic biomes. And then there's going to be, parts that are kind of a mixture of both, have brackish water. Freshwater biomes would be things like lakes, river biomes, versus saltwater biomes or marine biomes are going to be oceans. Um, the earth is covered in mostly water, and so those aquatic biomes are incredibly important. However, IB will focus mostly on terrestrial biomes, and specifically these ones that are listed here: the tropical forest, the temperate forest, the taiga, the grassland, the tundra, and the hot desert. Scientists definitely debate on how many biomes there actually are. There are often many more biomes that can be associated around the world, but again, these are the ones that IB will focus on, so these are the ones that we will focus on. They're a little more general. Okay, starting with the tropical forest. So I like to think of this as like the tropical rainforest, for example. So you can see it's very much so near the equator, where things are incredibly stable. They tend to have high temperatures and a lot of precipitation and a good amount of light, high light intensity. This is really good for plants. However, very little seasonal variation, no seasons, right? They typically experience the most direct sunlight, and due to that, they will have 12 hours of day and 12 hours of night almost all year long. Organisms that live there are well adapted to this type of climate. Examples that are given are going to be the Meranti tree. The Meranti trees are a type of tree that grows really, really tall above all of the other trees. They also tend to have a really wide base at the bottom. You can't quite see it here, but that allows it to kind of like really root itself in the ground. Um, the wood that they are made up of is very hard and dense. The overall shape of their leaves will allow for water to sort of just like flow right off of them. They have this kind of pointed tip. So that's important since they get so much rainfall there. They also have enzymes that are adapted to withstand higher temperature fluctuations, which is good because otherwise their enzymes would denature at these high temperatures and wouldn't work well for them. The spider monkey is a good example of an animal that has adaptations for the tropical rainforest. It tends to have very long, lean limbs, and it can actually use its tail as like a fifth limb. And this is really important for these organisms to climb and swing from tree to tree. Its feet is also kind of hand-like, which is important, helps it to gather food. It also has a highly developed larynx, which allows for it to make a lot of calls. The larynx is like the voice box. A lot of calls throughout the canopy, throughout the trees, to be able to talk to or communicate with other spider monkeys. The temperate forest has more moderate temperatures, sort of medium temperatures, and it can be found sort of like mid-latitude here, and then you can see also down here. It gets a pretty good amount of precipitation, high to medium. It also gets pretty good amounts of light. So again, this is where you're going to see those seasons, right? Those all 4 seasons are typically happening here in the temperate forest. Lots of animals are well adapted to these types of seasonal fluctuations. Black bears, for example, they can do well in the winter and well in the summer because they will just hibernate in the winter. They also have a really thick coat, which allows for them to stay warm. They have long claws, which are good for climbing trees, and they have a really diverse diet. So they can eat plants, they can eat insects, they can eat different types of fruits. Deciduous trees are usually the types of trees that you would find here. That's like a typical tree that does go through those seasonal variations. So they're going to change their colors in the fall and then lose their leaves in the winter and then stay dormant all winter long before they once again grow their leaves back in the spring. These types of trees also tend to grow really large and flat or wide leaves in the warm temperature months, which is really good for photosynthesis because that's a lot of surface area to collect the light and also a lot of surface area below to exchange the gases. The taiga. The taiga is typically found very, very high up in regards to latitude. It has low temperatures. It's very, very cold up towards the poles. It gets a fair amount of precipitation, often in the form of snow. It will have seasons, however, it's going to have a much shorter summer and a very long and cold winter. And again, it will have organisms that are highly adapted that can survive that type of extreme temperature fluctuation. The lynx is an example of a large cat that can withstand these really extreme temperatures of the taiga biome. They have a thick fur in the winter, particularly on its face. You can see that here. And it's going to go through a shedding in the warm temperature months, so we'll release some of that coat. That way it won't be so hot during those warmer temperature months. They also have very large paws that are pretty webbed, and so they kind of act like snowshoes. They also have small ears, and small ears have less surface area, which releases less heat, so it allows for them to stay warmer in those cold months. Up in these areas, the types of trees we tend to find are going to be conifers. So these are going to be your cone-bearing trees. So think like pine trees. Pine trees have this overall shape that's sort of shaped like an overall cone, and that's important because as the snow falls, it can like fall down. The tree also helps it kind of slide off. It also has very flexible branches, and that way when the snow drops on it and it's very heavy, doesn't break the branches. Again, it helps the snow to sort of fall off the trees and not do too much damage to the tree when it does hold the snow. It also tends to have waxy needles instead of leaves. It's more like modified leaves. And these needles are important, and when they're coated in wax, it helps them to conserve water when they don't have enough during certain parts of the year. The grasslands. You kind of find the grasslands sort of along the mid area right here, but these tend to be, again, in more like high-ish temperatures, high to medium temperatures, and they do get a medium amount of rainfall, so pretty good precipitation. They also get kind of a lot of light as well. And they do have some seasonal variations since they're not like exactly along the equator, especially the ones that are farther away from the equator. But within their seasons, they do tend to have at least a dry or cold season. And so organisms, again, would have to be well adapted to these grasslands. A type of plant that would be well adapted would be grasses. Grasses have deep roots that allow for it to access water. And this is also important because the grasslands do tend to have a lot of fires that go through there because they do tend to get very dry, especially if they have a dry season. And that's like a lot of dry plant matter that if a fire does come, it can cause a lot of long-term burning. The fire can go and go and go for a long period of time. However, with its deep roots, that helps it to access fire, and then hopefully it will be able to come back fairly quickly after a fire has occurred. They also have seeds that are dispersed by wind. So this allows for the seeds to be released from the grasses, and then they can be carried large distances due to the wind versus like insect dispersal. So some plants are going to have like insects that need to disperse the pollen, but here it's different. Their seeds are dispersed by wind, so they can typically go farther distances. Zebra are going to be a good example of an animal that is well adapted to these grasslands. They have teeth that are adapted for eating these grasses. They're an herbivore. They tend to have very large eyes that are kind of on the side of their head too, which enhances them, allows them to be alert for predators. And they also have big ears that helps them to watch out for predators like lions that would live in this area also. Their large ears also help them to survive some of that heat because big ears release heat. Opposite of the lynx, right, where small ears sort of help conserve that heat. They're going to release less heat. Zebras have big ears to release more heat, and that helps to cool them down. Same with elephant. That's actually why elephants have such big ears, because it helps them to release that heat and helps them to stay a little more cool. And they would also be found in the grasslands. The tundra are going to be your extreme extremes, so like at the poles, high or low. The tundra has very, very low temperatures, and it tends to not have as much precipitation compared to the taiga. It also doesn't get a lot of light due to extreme angles at which the sun hits it. They do have some seasonal fluctuation, but it tends to be like extreme. Short summers, long cold winters, essentially, almost all year long. They do have organisms that are well adapted to surviving in these areas. For example, the Arctic fox. The Arctic fox has a lot of fur, 2 layers of fur to help keep it warm. It also has really furry paws to help keep in some of that warmth because foxes and other animals that have paw pads, they actually can lose heat through their paw pads. They tend to have small ears, again, to release less heat or keep in warmth. And they actually tend to have more fat within their body during the cold temperature months that help to act as an insulator. And then obviously they can camouflage with their light colored fur. The types of plants that tend to live in the tundra are going to be perennial plants. Perennial plants are going to be plants that have really long lifespans. These are the types of plants that, like, if you garden and if you don't have to replant, for example, those plants every year, if they just come back automatically, those are going to be the ones that are going to be like the perennials. They often grow low to the ground, where that means they like have like really shallow roots that tend to grow pretty wide. And think like mosses. Mosses are a good example of a plant, just really, really low plants. Tundra actually means treeless. So there's not a lot of trees that live there. It's actually, really, really short plants. And then we have the hot desert. The hot desert is just like it sounds. It's hot, so really high temperatures, and it tends to be very, very dry. They do tend to get a good amount of light, and then minimal seasonal variation. It just tends to be really hot and dry almost all year long. Cacti are well adapted to being able to live there. They have very, very deep roots. They also tend to be kind of wide in their root system, and this allows for them to have good access to water. They can also store a lot of water year-round so that when it's dry, they don't die. They often have pleats that will expand to help them store water. And then, of course, they have cam physiology, which, remember, that means their stoma are closed all day and open at night to exchange the gases, allowing them to store carbon dioxide for longer periods of time. The fennec fox is a good example of an animal that is adapted for the hot desert. It has nice camouflage for a sandy or sort of rocky, sort of sedimentary rock is what I'm trying to think of. They tend to be nocturnal, which allows for them to hunt basically at night when it's cooler and there's less competition. And then that way they can sleep during the day when it's really, really hot out. They also burrow underground to help keep them cool and protected. They've got large ears to dissipate some of that heat. And then they have hair-covered paw pads to help protect their paws from the hot ground that they often have to walk on. We're done with the notes, but here's just a few questions that we can go through to see how well you're understanding the information. So which of the following is an abiotic factor influencing the environment? Birth rates, number of species, number of organisms, or soil composition? The correct answer would be D, soil composition. Which term fits the following definition? All of the different populations in a given area. Organisms, populations, communities, or ecosystems. Communities. Which of the following abiotic factors has the greatest influence on the metabolic rates of plants and animals? Water, wind, temperature, rocks and soil, or disturbances? Whoops, going back. Hopefully you came up with temperature. Temperature affects the rates of metabolic reactions because low temperatures slow down these enzymatic reactions. Higher temperatures are going to speed it up until we've reached the point of denaturing, in which case it will drastically decrease once again. Which of the following statements about light in aquatic environments is or are true? Water selectively reflects and absorbs certain wavelengths of light. Photosynthetic organisms that live deep in water probably use red light. Light intensity is an important abiotic factor in limiting the distribution of photosynthetic organisms. A and C are both true. A, B, and C are all true. Hopefully you picked D, that A and C are both correct, but B is not correct. B is not correct because remember we said that the algae that live towards the bottom of the ocean tend to be red algae, which means they're not using red light. Red light has the least amount of energy of all the wavelengths, so it has the hardest time getting down to those deep ocean depths. Blue light tends to have much more energy and tends to be able to make it down a little farther. In which of the following biomes would you expect to see the most biodiversity due to warm, stable temperatures, high levels of precipitation, and little to no seasonal variation? The temperate forest, the desert, the tropical forest, the grasslands, the taiga, or the tundra? Hopefully you picked tropical forest. And that is it for the first part of the ecology notes. And I apologize for my puppies causing so many interruptions today.